Following the initial spree in the crimes in the saga, now known as the Jack the Ripper murders, that began on August 31st, 1888, with the murder of Mary Nichols in Bucks Row, Whitechapel, and culminated with the double murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes on the 30th of September, the people of the East End of London were given a brief respite from their autumn of terror. Indeed, there were no murders throughout the whole of October 1888. Quite why this should have been is impossible to ascertain. It may have been that the murderer was away from London during this period, or it could have been that the intensification of the police activity in the area made it impossible for him to strike again. However, just because there were no Jack the Ripper murders during the month of October, it doesn't mean that crime ceased in the district. Indeed, the criminals of Whitechapel and Spitalfields remained as active as ever, and several cases throughout October ensured that the newspapers were able to report on various attacks that occurred during that month, albeit the circumstances surrounding them were nowhere near as dramatic as those surrounding the initial Whitechapel murders. Central to the lawlessness of the district were the common lodging houses of Spitalfields and Whitechapel, which, thanks to press reporting on the murders of Mary Nichols and Annie Chapman, were being portrayed in the newspapers as dens of thievery, vice and iniquity. Historically, it can be quite difficult to gauge what the inhabitants of these places were like, since those who ran them and who were associated with them were reluctant to speak ill of them. However, every so often, cases came before the courts that provided an insight into what went on in many of the lodging houses, and it has to be said, if these cases were typical of life in an East End common lodging house, well, let's just say that the inhabitants weren't a particularly pleasant bunch, and the less streetwise who found themselves having to spend a night within their decaying walls did so at their own risk, and they quite literally took their lives in their hands. The following article, which appeared in Reynolds' newspaper on Sunday, October the 14th, 1888, illustrates just how dangerous the district could be for strangers who found themselves on its streets late at night. It features the story of an attack on a Swedish student that had taken place at a common lodging house in Flower and Dean Street, Spitalfields. This street had had a dire reputation for decades, but had recently had a spotlight shone on it because both Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes had been residing at common lodging houses there prior to their murders. The article read, Mary Hawke, 18, who gave an address in Gun Street, Spitalfields, and James Fordham, 21, a painter, refusing his address, were charged before Mr. Montague Williams with having been concerned with others in assaulting Carl Edwin Hellman and robbing him of a purse containing £4 and a pair of trousers. The prosecutor's evidence was taken through Mr. Carmelli, interpreter. Hellman, who is a Swede, described himself as a student. Late at night he was in the neighbourhood of Whitechapel, the worse for drink, and he got into the company of some women, one of whom he accompanied to Thrawl Street, Spitalfields, whence he was taken into a common lodging house in Flower and Dean Street. Almost immediately he did so, 4 or 5 men rushed in, seized him, and threw him on the bed, where he was held down by the throat and robbed of his purse and trousers. He was then taken from the room and thrust down the stairs. He was screaming very loudly then, and just as he was thrown downstairs, police constables Wright and Dennis, H Division, burst in at the street door. It seemed from the evidence of a Mr. Percy Carton, ship's steward, that he and a friend had noticed the prosecutor being pulled down Thrawl Street by the women and had informed the constables. Directly they passed the lodging house in Flower and Dean Street, constables Wright and Dennis heard screams, and when they entered the house, the men who had been attacking Hellman vanished. The police said that the deputy was not to be found, and they were shown by the prosecutor the room in which he had been robbed. It was explained that these apartments are merely divisions of a very large room, the partitions not reaching to the ceiling, so that it is possible by mounting a table or short ladder to look over the top into the next room. Police Constable Wright did that and saw the prisoners in bed. They seemed to be asleep, but he made the woman open the door. She was then seen to be trying to shuffle something out into the next room, and the article picked up proved to be the prosecutor's trousers. She denied all knowledge of them, and so did Fordham, but when the latter got out of bed, the prosecutor said that he was one of the men who had attacked him. When the bed was searched, the purse was found, but only with £1 10 in it. A handkerchief belonging to Hellman was also discovered, and he said he believed Hawkes to be the young woman who took him to the lodging house. Fordham asserted that he had been in bed for 2 hours and knew nothing of any robbery. Mr. Percy Carton stated that Fordham was out in the street watching the women and the prosecutor, and had even spoken to him on the matter. He left, and the witness and his friends saw him enter the lodging house, where 10 minutes later the complainant was heard screaming. On Friday, the prisoners were again brought up. Margaret Brown, a young woman, deposed that she acted as deputy of the house. The house was owned by Mr. Coates, who kept a chandler's shop in Dorset Street and lived in Whitecross Street. Replying to the magistrate, the witness said that there were 19 double beds and 17 singles in the place. She had sole charge of the place and was paid 6 shillings a week for the duties she performed. Police Constable Dennis, 57H, said that the single beds were undivided and stood in rows in a large room, the double beds being in small rooms that were made by partitioning a larger one. The partitions did not touch the floor or the ceiling, a space of about 18 inches being left top and bottom. A person might pass from one room to another with a good squeeze. Police Sergeant 32H said that the registered lodging houses in the district were 127 in number, common lodging houses accommodating about 6,000 persons. They were all visited by the police once a week on average. He doubted if a single registered lodging house would be found without thieves and prostitutes among its lodgers. Mr. Williams directed that the proceedings at the lodging house in question were to be reported at Scotland Yard. The prisoners were committed to the session. Unfortunately, once the couple had been committed for trial, the newspapers appear to have lost interest in the case, and I have been unable to find any reports regarding what happened to them when they appeared at the sessions. They were both habitual offenders, as is evidenced by a report in the Eastern Evening News, which stated that previous convictions were then proved against both the prisoners. The man had been several times sentenced for felony, and the woman twice for cutting and wounding, her last sentence being 12 months. The same report also stated that their victim, Carl Edwin Hellman, was not in court when they were committed, as he was on the eve of starting for America, leading the magistrate to remark that he should chance the prosecutor being in attendance at the trial. If he was not, the judge would probably deal with the matter. What is intriguing about the case, however, is that it provides us with a glimpse of life within the common lodging houses of Spitalfields that played such a central role in the saga of the Whitechapel murders, and it gives us some idea of the type of characters that frequented them. And if what occurred to the unfortunate Swedish student is anything to go by, they were far from pleasant places, and their inhabitants were anything but law-abiding citizens.